Okay. How's it going? All right. So, welcome to our class tonight. The 7 Habits of Self-Refinement. I'm just going to play with the camera for a second.
Judy says it's good.
It's good.
Yeah.
Hi, Judy, out there. Okay. So tonight it's a special edition class at the Tuesday night Torah studies at Chabad of Pittsford. Tonight we're going to start a series called the 7 Habits of Self-Refinement, and tonight will be part 1, which is an introduction. The historical before we talk about the historical background, tonight's topic is very timely because many people don't realize that Passover is a major holiday. We had a whole class on that, how amazingly enough, like 70% and more of Jewish people observe Passover at some level. And, hello, there you go. And many other people are familiar that Shavuot, which is 50 days later, is also a big holiday. It celebrates the giving of the Torah. But what many people don't realize is that the in-between time... Hello? Here you go. Just welcoming real people, live,
Real.
tangibly present people, and want to give a welcome as well to our many online real people as well. So we started saying how Pesach, we had a class on that, and that's pretty famous. Shavuos, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, is 50 days after Pesach. What many people might not be familiar with, or might somewhat be familiar with, is that the 49 days between are a very special time. They're not holidays. They're not like Shabbat or Yom Tov where you take off work and you cook more than is imaginable, more than you should. But it's regular work days, besides Shabbat. But they're also it's a very unique period right now. And that is called the period called the counting of the Omer. So the counting of the Omer is a 49-day period which starts the second night of Passover and goes all the way till right before Shavuot. So before we describe what it is, both the nuts and bolts of it and the deeper underpinnings and the deeper ideas behind it, let's just go through the historical background. So many people are familiar with Moshe's statement that, it's been made famous by a demonstration, picket signs, let my people go. But of course there's a second part to that verse, which is, let my people go, ... so that they may serve me. Moshe said that many times when he confronted Pharaoh. Let my people, meaning my, capital M, God's people go, so they may serve God when they get freed. Which, this even goes back to as far as the burning bush, where Moshe was told, God said to Moshe, you're going to go on this great mission of confronting Pharaoh in order so the Jews will be able to become my servants and my people. So you see the connection. It's not just like, we had some downtime. We had to, the rabbis needed to make the in-between period a little more, exciting. So they gave it a little bit of a mitzvah. You see the whole Pesach to Shavuos is a continuum. From the beginning, before Passover happened, it was said this whole Exodus is going to be till we get to a certain place, which is the giving of the Torah. So it makes sense they're connected. But we're going to get to see how they got connected in a very special way. So here's the timeline. The people of Israel departed Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, the first day of Passover. And on the 6th of Sivan, 50 days later, they got the Torah. And as we said, the Jews that first year, and truthfully every year since, counted every day of the 49 period between Pesach and the giving of the Torah. So here's the question. The Jews counted down, or they counted up to the giving of the Torah. And why? Why'd they count? So, there's three reasons given, or three famous reasons. There could be more. But let's go through the first one. The Jews were very excited to get the Torah. Moshe told them, all these miracles and Exodus and Red Sea splitting and miracles, it's not just hallelujah, we're free. It's to become with a people with a purpose. And they knew that was going to happen when they got the Torah. So they were counting down, or to be more exact, they were counting up till the big day. That is from commentary Rabbeinu Nissim. A parable for this, of why were they counting? Imagine that there was once a poor man in a pit. And, desolate, tattered clothes, alone. And suddenly a nobleman, who turns out to be the crown prince, passes by and and he says, my good man, in a few days' time, I'm going to come. I'm going to take you out of the pit. And I'm going to make you one of my inner cabinet. I'm going to give you clothes, royal clothes and riches. And I'm going to give you a mansion. And you're going to be, you're very wise. I'm going to make you part of my inner cabinet. And not only that, says the crown prince, you look like a very special man, albeit in unfortunate circumstances. I'm going to give you my daughter's hand in marriage. Sounds like Aladdin, sort of. So sure enough, a few days later, the crown prince comes back, and he does all that. He gets a rope, and he takes him out, and he sends him to a barber and a spa, and he puts him in royal clothes, and he gives him riches, and he's, wow, from rags to riches. He's so happy. But he knows that he's going to get him something more special. He's going to be able to marry the princess, or marry into this very special ruler's family. And because he saw this ruler, it doesn't just mince words. He promised me the clothes, the riches, and the house, and he came through. I'm awaiting the days for an even greater prize, for even greater, experience, which is to marry his daughter and marry into the family. Which is sort of why the Jews, they saw that God promised them through Moshe, they're going to leave Egypt. About a year earlier, when it wasn't so pashut, it wasn't so simple. They were being whipped with slavery, and any type of freedom looked very bleak. As a matter of fact, when Moshe came, it got worse. Right? Moshe said, Pharaoh, let them go. I'm going to make their slavery harder. Well, what happens? They believe in Moshe. And sure enough, Moshe, God's messenger, comes through, and they miraculously, on the 15th of Nisan, at the stroke of midnight, they leave Egypt, or they're allowed to leave Egypt. And they go out in the Red Sea, the miracles of the splitting of the Red Sea, and they go out with great riches. God came through the first part of his promise. Let my people go. I'm going to take them out. And so they knew that there's something greater to follow. They're going to get God's wisdom, God's treasure, the Torah. And they saw that God kept half the promise. They eagerly awaited the next part of the promise. Incidentally, they didn't count down, they actually counted up, which we'll see. They didn't say, only 48 days left to go, only 47, because that would remind them of how long they had to go. So it's more like, I guess you count how many days have passed, which is, at least, this chunk of time out of the 50 days have passed. So that's a very simple reason. They were just excited to get the Torah and become more solidified as God's people. And that's why they did the Sefirat. Sefirat means counting. Number 2, another reason given. This is by Rabbi Avadia Sefarno, I believe a 16th century commentator on the Torah. And he says like this: God's message to the Jews from the very beginning. What was the first mitzvah the Jews got? What? Well, that's Adam. Adam got Pru'uvu, be fruitful, multiply. But the first mitzvah the Jews got was the Jewish calendar. To sanctify the new moon and make that the first of the month. And basically got the Jewish calendar, which we're still very confused about. Is Pesach in the winter in Rochester? Is it?
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
50 days from Pesach to Shavuot, that means that they were in the desert for 10 days before Moshe went up?
50 days.
Right.
They were a week till the Red Sea, and then from the Red Sea till there was 43 days, I guess, yeah. 43.
I thought that
A
they
total of
traveled.
A total of 49 days. The 50th day was the giving of the Torah.
Right, but I thought this was, obviously, this is in the calendar. But I thought that they traveled in the desert. According to some things that I've read, they were in the desert for several months before they got to Har Sinai. Where does that come from?
It was 50 days, one whole month, and a little bit of Nisan, the whole of Iyar, and a little bit of Sivan. And that's...
Well, no, this definitely is correct, actually.
Maybe you're thinking of another thing that they waited for, maybe...
No, this history book that I used to use said there were several months of being in the desert. It actually said 3 moons, so...
I don't know.
Okay.
I have to see the book. So this is really interesting. The first message, and this idea fits very well with the idea that the first sort of like, one of the first things the Jews did was count the Omer, count down or count up to the giving of the Torah, because the first mitzvah God gave them was the new moon, which is really saying, you're now free. You want to be free? You have to be, you are now free men. With that comes responsibility to be in charge of your time. Meaning, don't just count days like a slave would. You're in prison, counting the days, 1, and then cross to the 5. Make the days count. That's a free man. A free person has the opportunity and responsibility to make every day the best it can be. As slaves, their time belonged to their masters, and they did not have the freedom to do as they pleased. God is now saying, you're free. You want the greatest gift is time. So now you're masters of time. So that was actually the first mitzvah from God. The first practice the Jews sort of instinctively did was, wait, we're in charge of our time? Let's start counting every day in preparation for the giving of the Torah. I believe a year later, I didn't check this up, but I think it was a year later that it became a God-given mitzvah to forever on commemorate the counting of the Omer by us counting the Omer as we do today. Okay, next page. After. Okay. Number 3. And this is a little bit of a glimpse to our main topic of the 7 habits of self-refinement. The deeper spiritual reason of why they were counting is as follows. It's brought down in Kabbalah and maybe even more Talmudic sources. there's 50 gates of impurity. Like, if you reach the 50th gate, there's no turning back. The Jews in Egypt, we spoke about this many times, were very assimilated. It wasn't like they still kept the Jewish identity. You know, their names were like Jeremy Greenbaum. They could tell they were Jewish, but many of them were very assimilated. And in those days, that was pagan assimilation. They had like a Jewish pagan, identity. They were, on one hand, proud Jews, but they also liked Egyptian culture and ideology. And because of that, the Jews spiritually were on a very low level when they came out. They were on the 49th level, like almost at the door of no return. But God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they're going to be taken out with great wonders, and God fulfilled that promise. And God had trust the Jews would redeem themselves if given the chance. And so God took them out. It's like a parent swooping in when the child, can't help themselves. Because at the end of the day, you want the child to succeed. You don't want the child to fail. Oh, it's the child's fault. He made bad choices. No, I'm going to intervene if I can. But at the same time, that's only a step one. They had to then, and that was Passover. But to get the Torah, you can't come as a puppet where, God took you out and you did nothing for it. They had to then climb day by day out of the 49 days of impurity, every day another gate of impurity, till finally they left all the impurity and they stood before Mount Sinai on the 6th day of Sivan, pure, ready, worked through. Spoiler alert, the Kabbalists explain that the 49 days that connect Passover with Shavuot correspond to the 49 drives and traits of the human heart. I mean, those gates of impurity we're going to see aren't just some type of voodoo, impure realm of purgatory, but it's actually, the idea of 49 corresponds to the emotions, all the possible human emotions and sub-emotions of the human heart. And each day, they both, refined themselves. They left a gate of impurity, and they also refined the human facet of the emotional makeup, which we'll get to later. Sure. There's actually a pitcher in the kitchen if you want to. There's cups in the kitchen as well. Sorry about that. All right. So let's go further in the handout. And I apologize, I meant to post online a link to the PDF. My apologies, we didn't get a chance to do that, so I'll try to read the main text slowly. A year later, or sometime later, God is giving, Moshe is being dictated how to write the mitzvahs down, and I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but the Torah tells us in Leviticus that in verse 23, chapter 23, verse 15, you shall count 7 full weeks for yourselves, from the day following the day of rest, from the day on which you bring the Omer as a wave offering. Count 50 days until the day following the 7th week. So I'm going to say that one more time for everybody watching online. Okay, here's the mitzvah in the Torah of counting the Omer, which is why we do it today. You shall count 7 full weeks for yourself. That's 49 days, okay. When? From the day following the day of rest, a little ambiguous. Now it gets more specific. That is, from the day on which you bring the Omer as a wave offering. We'll say in a moment what the Omer offering was. Count 50 days until the day following the 7th week. Okay, so we're going to go back to this verse later, but it's referred to, the counting of the 7 weeks is referred to by its starting point from the day they brought the Omer offering. What was the Omer offering? Which is why we call it sort of synonymous. Sephira means the counting. Omer means of the Omer. What's the Omer? I thought we're just counting. It's count down or count up to
It's a measure of
Mata Torah. So, but what does that have to do with we just spoke about the basic reason of why we count is because sort of reenacting what the Jews did then. They were counting up or refining themselves as they approached the giving of the Torah. So why is it referred to as the counting of the Omer? So what was the Omer? So during the Holy Temple times, the Omer offering, which Omer, as Tzipi said, is a measurement, a standard measurement. It was actually a measurement of barley for this particular offering. It was brought on the second night of Pesach. At the end of counting 49 days, they actually bring another offering, which was the two breads, which was made of wheat. It was on Shavuot. One of the special things they would bring in the temple was an offering of very fine wheat bread. So the amount of barley is called an omer. It was a barley offering. They had to take the first cutting of barley, of grain actually. They cut it and they made it into a offering which was offered in the temple. Omer is a food measurement. It could have been used for anything. It happens to refer to the barley offering, but it could have been anything. We'll see in a moment. There's other examples of Omer. It's about 3.64 liters. Examples of Omer in other places in the Torah. It says when the Jews got the manna, it was in 1 Omer per head. Meaning each person got an Omer amount per person. Another important, relevant today is the mitzvah of challah. Is you only have to separate challah, meaning when you make any bread, a dough, you're supposed to take. You have to have a minimum amount in which to separate a little bit of dough, which in the old days would go to the Kohen. Today we just burn it, and that minimum measurement has to be a omer, which we said is about 3.64 liters. I'm not sure what dry measurement would be. Because it says you bring the bechal, it says the first portion of your dough. When you need an amount of dough that you remember from the desert when they had the manna. What was that? That was an omer. We know that from Rashi. Okay. That's just a point of what the omer actually was. Today, we don't have the temple. So how do we don't do the barley offering where the Kohen would go down, he'd cut the first, with a sickle, they would cut the first growth of barley and make it in, they'd grind it, they would bake it and make it into some sort of offering. But we don't have a temple, we don't do offerings today. So we don't have that, but we do have the other part of the verse is that, as we said, you shall count 7 full weeks for yourselves. So before we talk about the more mystical idea of what the mechanics are, what the Jews were doing, how they were refining themselves, and how we can learn to refine ourselves today, it's important to know that Judaism is first and foremost a religion of action. And it's also a religion of tremendous philosophy and ideas and emotion and self-development. But let's start with the practical, because that's, as it says, Ma'aseh hu ikir, the deed is key. We want to, of course, get the idea behind it and the emotions behind it, but it should all be about actually doing the mitzvah at the end of the day, of course, with the most optimal kavanah intent. I'm sorry?
Or do the mitzvah.
And do the mitzvah. We'll get to do it also. Real live demo. Okay. So When do we count the Omer? As we said, starts the second night of Passover through Shavuot, till the night before Shavuot. One may count at any time throughout the night. And incidentally, if someone asks you, like, what's tonight's Omer, you shouldn't answer, because if you do, then you can't say the blessing, because you already did it. You can only say a blessing usually before a mitzvah. If you would like to, oh, tonight is X, Y, and Z night of Omer. Oh my gosh, I already sort of counted it already. I can't now do it again with a bracha. Small detail. What if you didn't count? What if you forgot to count? So if you forgot to count at night, it goes like this. Every night you have to count. The way the verse indicates is that it's an individual. It's an individual requirement, and you have to count both the days and the weeks. You'll see how it is in the actual mitzvah. But if you miss a night, there's a certain lacking. If you're not counting the whole thing, you counted most of it, but you missed one night. So you wouldn't be able to. You can still do the mitzvah, but you wouldn't be able to do it with a blessing. But if let's say you missed that one night, and the next day you caught yourself, you could still say it without a blessing, and the next nights you can count with a blessing. But those are more of the details of the laws. So let's actually right now, let's count today's Omer. So I actually am still counting the blessing. Sometimes I'm not this far into it, but I am. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al Sefirat Haomer hayoim achad asar yoim shehem shavu echad v'arba yamim la'omer. Today is 11 days, which is 1 week and 4 days of the Omer. So we can just analyze that. There's also a blessing we say after it. I'll say it in English. Master of the universe, you've commanded us through Moses, your servant, to count Sefirat Haomer in order to purify us from our evil and uncleanliness. As you have written in your Torah, you shall count for yourselves from the day following the day of rest, from the day on which you bring the Omer as a wave offering. The counting shall be for 7 full weeks. Until the day following the 7th day shall you count 50 days. So that the souls of your people Israel may be cleansed from their defilement. Therefore may it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, and the merit of the Sefirat Haomer which I counted today, the blemish that I have caused in the Sephira Netzach Shebegvura, be rectified, and I may be purified and sanctified with supernal holiness. May abundant bounty thereby be bestowed upon all the worlds. May it rectify our nefesh, ruach, neshama from every basis and defect. May it purify and sanctify us with your supernal holiness. Amen. Selah. That was a real counting of the Omer, live. Okay. Now we had the introduction of the historical background of the Sefirat Haomer, as well as some of the reasons why they counted and why the Jews counted then. Let's talk about today. We do a mitzvah today. Why do we do this mitzvah today? Anybody want to share? Online viewers, you also can give the answer. Why are we counting today? So we said before, because
it seems analogous to being there. I mean, we were there at the party of the Red Sea. We're supposed to be like we were there at the party of the Red Sea. So it's just, our ancestors did it. It's really to us.
So thank you, Gary. It didn't just happen then. It happened then, but it also, we were there as well. I mean, it happened then and we were there, and at some level we have to feel like it's happening now. As the Exodus, as every generation, a person has to look at as if they left Egypt, and we had the whole class on that last time. But after that introduction, let's jump to the main title. We said we're going to talk about the 7 habits of self-refinement. To keep us oriented on the main points, and also to review, everything goes back to the verse. You know, you can wax poetic or philosophical the whole night. as the 5 rabbis in the Haggadah, they discussed the Exodus the whole night till the students said, it's time for the Shema. We're not going to do the whole night. We have a cutoff of 9 o'clock. Yeah, we could, but we're not going to. So let's read this. Again, I'm going to repeat the verse. It's actually right here in the handout a second time. And then I'm going to cut it up to different parts of the verse, because those parts of the original biblical verse, to do this mitzvah, sheds light about why we do it today, how we can feel like we're going through the same self-refinement process today, and what the mechanics of that self-refinement process is. I mean, you can say you feel it, but if you don't really understand, you can say, "Oh, I feel it." What do you mean you feel it? We don't know. If you don't know what you're talking about, it's like, "Oh, it's an emotional connectivity. I can't explain it." Well, either yes or no. But if we can define it of what it was actually back then, on a deeper spiritual level, which is what Kabbalah and Hasidism does, then even if we're lacking, we're not actually in the Sinai desert right now, and we're not even in the times of the temple when they had the more, visual of the Omer offering. But even though we're just doing it verbally and conceptually, but if we can understand it, we can really feel like we're going through this self-refinement process and really relive the Pesach to Shavuot experience. Okay, so the verse again is, for those tuning on now, we're saying the verse again. You shall count 7 full weeks for yourselves, from the day following the day of rest, from the day on which you bring the Omer as a wave offering. Count 50 days until the day following the 7th week. Again, Leviticus chapter 23, Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15. So 3 important parts I want to point is this. 1, you shall count 7 full weeks for yourselves. V'sefartem lechem, you shall count for yourself. Number 2, it points out the starting point of the process. What was what's the icon? What's the what do you call it? The marker for when this starts, which is when they brought the Omer, which seems to be sort of like incidental to the counting, right? What is the day of National Bankers Day? Let's say it happened to be the second day of Passover. By the way, National Bankers Day is the onset of this mitzvah. So is it incidental that there happened to be an offering the second day of Passover called the Omer offering, and it was a good, by the way, that's a good marker to know when you begin the counting of the Omer. Or is the fact they brought this unique barley offering, the Omer offering then, very symbolic and integral to the whole counting process? Let's find out. Number 3, another way it mentions when they started the counting is very, very ambiguous. It's not just ambiguous, but for us, it was ambiguous in the times of the Talmud. It says, another indicator of when they would start the counting every year, the day Machar Shabbat, which means, it's translated, the day following the day of rest. So, what does that mean to you simply? When did they start counting? Machar Shabbat. Sunday, right? The day after Shabbat is the day after Saturday, is Sunday. But that's actually not what it means. Because Shabbat in that context means, Shabbat could also mean a holiday. It means, and there's different other reasons in the Talmud, they explain why, although it can be misleading, it really refers to the day after Passover, the day after the first day of Passover, which is, for some weird reason, referred to as Shabbat. I mean, it is also a Shabbat. Every holiday is a Sabbath. But why don't you say the day after the first day of Passover? Why are you being more vague? This was a big problem in the Talmudic era, because there was a group called the Baisusim, which were a group of Jews who left the mainstream of the Talmudic, rabbinic Jewish community. And they said they rejected the oral Torah. They said, we're going to take the Torah extremely literal. So it says eye for an eye, it means literally eye for an eye. And other things like that. We know in Judaism that the Torah, of course, is to be read straightforwardly, but Moshe was given a contextual, oral commentary to explain the context of what things mean. It's also, if you can decode it, which the rabbis and the Talmud did, it's also sort of makes sense as well, but they rejected all that, this group called the Bai Susim. They said, we only take it literal. And therefore, in this particular verse, they said, oh, you're reinterpreting, you're saying it means the day after Passover. Yeah, it says the day after the barley, but we're taking literally, it has to only be the day after a Shabbat. So if Passover is on a Tuesday, they wouldn't start counting. They'd say we're waiting till Shabbat, and the day after Shabbat, we're going to start counting. Yes?
So Shavuot, though, is going to be the same time or a different time?
So they would then say it would actually be different, right? Because it would be a 50. We know it has to be a 50 days after Shavuot, is 50 days after Pesach.
Are there groups still like that today?
There's a group called the Karaites, which used to be huge in the times of Maimonides. Also similar, rejected oral interpretation, and were very literalists. There's maybe very little in Israel. Most of these groups that left the mainstream of the Jewish rabbinic, Talmudic, vast, scholarship, and they did their own thing. Eventually, they died out, or they, assimilated to other groups. So these are the three things we want to talk about. I want to point to something very special this year. This year is a year of Pesach. The first day of Pesach was Shabbat. So this year, actually, we're doing the verse the same, meaning literally and contextually. So let's start with the idea of the counting, the 7 full weeks of counting for yourself. What do you mean counting for yourself? Like if you count, I'm 1, 2, 3. If I'm counting, I'm counting for. What does counting for yourself indicate?
Perspective.
But before we get to the more deeper, refinement part, you have to count the Omer. What does it mean? You have to count for yourself.
It's an individual thing.
It's an individual thing versus a collective. Certain mitzvot can be done by the rabbis. Not many. Don't take that wrong, online viewers. The rabbis can't do mitzvahs for you. We can't do atonement for everybody. But what it means is that certain mitzvahs, for example, the Jewish calendar, who would set the new month? It was the obligation of the Beis Din, of the Jewish Supreme Court in Jerusalem. You can't decide when the new moon is. You have to actually follow. It was set, and the calendar, the Jubilee year, the 50 years, that was done by the rabbis, by the Beis Din for the Jews. But this, it says you have to do for yourself, which means literally you have the. That's why if you want to make say the blessing of it, which means you're doing the mitzvah in its entirety, if you miss a day, you can't, because I can't cover for you. Anyways, the deep purpose of counting the Omer, we said, was a self-refinement. A very cool thing in the words. The word for counting in Hebrew is usafartem. Usafartem lechem. You shall count for yourself. The root of the word is samach pei resh, saper. So to count can also be the same root word. Samach peresh can mean to shine. Sapir, like sapphire. The word sapphire shares that. Sapphire comes in Hebrew, which is a very similar word, is a luminous stone. So you shall count for yourself can also be translated, if you want to. You shall make luminous for yourself, which fits very well. The Jews weren't just counting down or counting up. They were shining themselves. They were refining themselves. Okay. What does that mean? What are the mechanics of that? So, here's where we get to and this will answer two of our questions, the counting, what it represents in the self-refinement process, and why the starting point was when they brought a barley offering. So, we said many times in this class that a human being has a soul. But you have two aspects of your soul, or two drives of your inner personality. One drive is called the animal soul. The animal soul is also referred to as the human soul. But it's the human soul that is akin to an animal, not because you're bad or anything, God forbid, but it's instinctive, it's reactive. It's I want to survive, I want to feel myself, just instinctive living, which we also call emotional living. I mean, basic emotional living. The goal in life is we come into this world, a soul into a body, and the goal is to take our more instinctive natures of our soul, the animal aspect of our soul, and to guide it by a higher purpose, or a godly, focus, a higher purpose focus, which we call the godly perspective. Or in simple terms, a human being is naturally emotional. When I say emotional, you have human needs, urges, not just physical ones, also emotional ones. And we play those things out like a sophisticated animal. The job in life of a civilized person is to develop a civilized, at the very least, a civilized intellect of what's appropriate, values, morals. At the very least, at the very best, it should be higher purpose, a godly purpose of living, not just base survival. And the goal in life is that the intellect should harness or direct the emotions. In other words, we're born in this world, we have a human drive like an animal drive. I want to survive, I want to feel good. If you wrong me, I wrong you. I'm out for myself, and so on and so forth. That's natural. A baby's born selfish. Not bad, just selfish, self-oriented. Maturity is when we can think with one of the great human gifts of abstract thinking or bigger picture thinking, and then say, you know what? Yeah, I would like to be greedy, or I would like to, be, for myself and not care about anybody else. But that's wrong. My brain, my intellect, my higher perspective tells me that's wrong. And therefore I'm not going to do it. So that's something we do day by day, week by week. And that is categorized in the whole concept of the counting of the Omer. Before we get to how it is in every day and every week, the 7 weeks times 7 days, this answers our question, why is the barley offering the starting point? Because barley in the Torah, compared to wheat, barley is called animal fodder. It was a more coarse grain. It wasn't as, special as wheat was. So barley's animal fodder. And that's exactly what we're doing in the counting of the Omer. This whole self-refinement process, we're trying to take our animal drive and slowly sublimate it to be driven and controlled by our mind, by our intellect, by our higher purpose, by our godly aspirations, not just by our base human desires and whims. And that's exactly why it started with a barley offering, this process. Because that's really the whole idea behind it. What did they do to the barley offering? So they would take young ears of barley that were moist, it was dried by fire, then it was ground, and it was sifted 13 times, and then it was lifted to God as an offering on the altar. So the barley is a visual metaphor for animal souls. We're being told, take your fresh barley, your fresh animal fodder, and burn that, and that's the juice of your desires and the steam. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to take that, we're going to burn it through a fire, we're going to refine it, which is the challenging discipline of restraint and respect for boundaries. We're going to grind it. In other words, we're going to sublimate the ego. And it's still not done. We're going to sift it 13 times. They sifted it, which was eliminating impurities. That's what sifting it. Why 13? I mean, that was like the most you can. I don't know the Kabbalistic or the metaphorical relevance, but like that was like super sifting back then for the best, flour possible. And finally, that's when you're going to elevate the animal soul, the inner animal. Okay, so that answers our question of why the counting the Omer starts from a barley offering. But we talked about, sorry, Gary.
It says right here on page 6 paragraph, the 7-hour emotional makeup.
I'm sorry, it's a mistake. The 7 hours.
7.
Forget the 7. Our emotional. Okay, we talked till now. The general idea, we're trying to refine the animal drive, which is what the Jews did. They're taking the most base human existence and they were elevating it day by day. But what's the details of this? So, what's a human being made up of? Tanya, which we've spoken about many times, says a human being, your inner makeup, you can summarize into two things: your intellect and your emotions. In even more contemporary speakies, it would be your perspectives, the way you perceive reality, and that would be the intellect, and the emotions would be the emotional, the feelings that those perceptions cause you to have. So if you have a very paranoid perspective of life, you feel an emotion of fear, a feeling of fear. But the human makeup is the intellect and the emotions, the perspectives and the feelings. When they would bring the barley offering, to redirect your intellect, is even the animal soul, the more human, not particularly idealistic part of ourselves, but just the pragmatic intellect that we live by. It's a little bit, it's more lofty than our emotions. Our emotions are really, on one hand, they're not as sophisticated as our intellect. But on the other hand, the emotions are more core of who we are, at the deepest part of who we are. So when we talk about refining the animal self, the inner animal, you have to refine the intellect. That's not so hard, because intellect in general is, it's metaphysical. It can understand things outside of itself. It's not as me directed, because using your brain, you're automatically being open to an idea which is outside of you. So to refine that took one day. That was the idea of the barley offering. They did it in one day. And today we don't have a barley offering. When we do what we're doing today, we study the laws of the Sefirat. We're using our intellect to talk about this mitzvah in addition that we're going over the do's and don'ts of a mitzvah, we're also refining our intellect, which is what the goal of the barley offering on the first day was. But what they do for 49 days, I mean, if you crushed and sifted and burned in the fire the barley offering, the Omer, on day one of this counting process, what was left? You got there. That only refines the easier, I would say the low-hanging fruit of the person. The intellect. Intellect is open to a more noble framework. And that took one day. But the other part of the human being's makeup, the emotions, that is rooted, our emotions are rooted, on one hand they're lower than the intellect, but in a sense they're even rooted in a deeper place than our intellect. It says be a mensch. And someone tells you be a mensch. What does it mean? Be a rocket scientist? He's a real mensch. She's a real mensch. It means they have good emotion, they have good characteristic traits. Because in a way, I forgot who it was that said, their whole life they respected intellect. It was a Jewish philosopher. And then later in life, he respected people that have good midos, good characteristic traits. To refine our characteristic traits, our emotive traits, which we're going to list them in a moment, is much harder because it's ingrained as who we are. But we can start, and that's why it took 49 days to do that. It's 7, we're going to see in this moment, there's 7 characteristic traits, 7 archetypes, and those 7 have the other 7, the whole set of 7 in each characteristic trait. Well, we'll give an example in a second. These 7 midot, or these 7 emotions, exist in every human being. We speak about man being created in the image of God. This is one of the ideas behind it, is that the Kabbalah says you have these 7 emotive traits inside of you, these midot. They are a reflection of the 7 characteristic traits, how God interacts and creates the world. So in the macrocosm, God has these 7 characteristics, which all these characteristics you're going to see are part of a creative process. We're getting low on battery here. And also these 7 characteristics individually are a facet of relationship. And God wanted to create the world. God wanted to have a relationship. So the Kabbalah says there was 10 Sefirot, 3 intellectual, but 7 emotional. And each day of the week God created the world was done with another one of these emotions, these expressions, per se. So let's get right to them. Number 1 is chesed, which it's hard to translate, but we'll say it's love, kindness, love/kindness. The second emotion is gevura, vigor, or discipline. Tiferet would be harmony or compassion. The fourth one is netzach, which refers to the human component of victory or determination. Hod, humility or devotion or sincerity. Yesod, foundation, bonding or connection. And malchut, majesty, dignity or leadership. This is only part 1 of this series. Next week we're going to go through a couple of these and really lay them out, but I want to give you the idea of how they play into the time we find ourselves. So these 7 emotional traits, which in the next few Tuesdays we're going to go through them at length, they're the general facets of internal human makeup. As we said, they're both individual emotions and they're also part of a collective whole, being part of bringing your inner self and expressing it to the outside or to another person. So during back to the 7 days of the week, the seven weeks of the Omer, 7 weeks times 7 days is 49. Each week we are refining one of these 7 emotions in the human being, in our own human being, in our own being. But there's 7 days. You're not doing the same thing every day. Every day you're refining a sub-emotion of that week's theme emotion. For example, the past week was the first week, last week, the first week of Passover, was the week of Passover was the week of Chesed, of kindness. So the first night, and if you turn to the next page, you'll see a very small chart. So the first day was kindness of kindness. The second day of the first week was Givura Shebechesed, severity of kindness. The third was Tiferet Shebechesed, harmony of kindness. The fourth, victory of kindness. And tonight, and so on and so forth. Tonight we said in the prayer, tonight was the 11th night of the Omer, and that was Netzach Shebegvura. That was victory of discipline. In the next few weeks, we're going to go through these emotions and what they are and how we can refine them in ourselves. But suffice to say, that's what this time period is for. So every day thus presents itself with a specific and clear objective: to work on and refine one aspect of our human, our natural makeup, our animal makeup, but to infuse it with a higher purpose. Not just say, it is what it is. Through this process, the soul matures and is ready to welcome the renewed manifestation of our divine soul that takes place when we get the Torah on Shavuot. So when Shavuot, it says actually there's 50 gates of understanding. A human being can only, on their own, achieve 49. That's why God says in the verse that, what was that? Count 50 days. You don't count 50 days, you only count 49 days. So it says you're counting 49 and you'll arrive at the 50th. That's the simple meaning. But what it really means is you're going to go through this process of refining your emotions and these subsets of the emotions. You can only do 49. That's the most a human being can strive to. But once you do that, God takes us to the next level, which we can't arrive at on our own, which is the 50th gate of understanding, which was what sort of the revelation of the giving of the Torah was. It wasn't something we could have come up with it ourselves or did ourselves, but we just made our receptacle, we made ourselves as pure and ready as possible to be a willing student, a willing disciple, a willing servant, and to refining every facet of our kishkas till finally we can get the Torah. One last thing. So we spoke about the ambiguity of it saying you should start this the day after Shabbat, which the rabbi says means you start this the day after Pesach, the day after the first day of Pesach. Why is it referring to a Shabbat? So Shabbat represents a special power. We know Shabbat's a special day of rest. God uplifts every human being in the whole world on Shabbat. But it's still the 7th day of the week, meaning it's the highest spiritual level, but it's connected to the week. It's still part of the cycle. To venture on this journey of really confronting yourself, confronting who you are, confronting your abilities that you can do good or waste them, and to be successful of utilizing them, is something that we as human beings cannot do on our own. Because at the end of the day, we're human. We are very self-directed. We are very limited. We do have blinders on. How do we know we're going to be successful on this journey of counting ourselves, of making ourselves shine? So the answer is, the power is Machar Shabbat, the day after the highest level of the natural cycle, the 8th day, which is always, Shabbat represents the highest within nature. The day after represents God's going to give you a spiritual, transcendent infusion in which you can then go refine yourself on your own. Both utilize your fragile, finite self, but at the same time, connect them, every bit of yourself, to something very, very deep, spiritual, intellect-driven, and even higher purpose-driven. To sum it up with a parable, there was once a people living in a valley. And the valley, for years, for hundreds of years, was enveloped in a great fog. And the sun could never shine through. So the elders said, there's a sun out there. They said, what? We just know a gray existence. There's a sun out there. And years went by. One day, the wind shifted, the fog, maybe it was somewhere deep in Scotland or something, and the sun peeked in. They saw everything in color for a brief moment. And they're like, wow, this is, it's true. But then the winds went back to normal and the fog enveloped and it was gray. So they're all excited there's color. But then they decided they're going to go on the journey climbing up the mountain. They want to re-exist. They don't want to live in gray. They want to live in rich color, vivid color. So they're going to go up the mountain. And that's a metaphor for Passover was this great light. God took us out. We did nothing for it. But as they say, easy come, easy go. If we really want to make something lasting, we have to work on it, which is sort of the two sides of our life. God jumpstarts us, but we're then required to be a partner in creation, or partner in creating a wonderful life and a wonderful world by working really, really hard with whatever we got, which is finite at the very best. But slowly but surely we climb up the mountain till finally we arrive to beyond the cloud, beyond the fog, and let the color in. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and join us next Tuesday, 8 o'clock. We're going to go through all the emotions, the psychoanalysis of what they mean in contemporary terms, and how we can truly refine ourselves in a real way and arrive at Shavuot. I forgot the English date of when that is, but it's like in 5.5 weeks or something. It's the 19th of May.
The first day is the 20th.
The 20th of May. May 20th is Shavuot. We want to get there and be in our shiniest, most lit up selves possible and really have real growth. Okay?
Judy and Anna listening.